My name is Tim Maywald. I have a degree in forestry from the Forestry School at Syracuse. I was trained as a tree steward in the Arlington-Alexandria Tree Stewards and joined the Charlottesville area Tree Stewards when I moved here in 2011. I'm on the Education Committee and deliver training to tree stewards and the public on planting, pruning, and invasive plant identification and treatment. Today we're going to talk about tree planting. As CATS members, we have two types of involvement in planting. First, we plant trees, and secondly, we educate the public on how to plant them. We perform plantings yearly at one place or another, usually public spaces, and you can help us with those plantings if you like. We also educate through our tree basics classes, tree tables, demonstration projects, and general outreach where you just may be speaking to your neighbor or to family members. You can certainly help us with those activities if you like. So even if you don't see yourself wielding a pick and shovel, you need to know how to plant. Tree stewards need to know how to plant trees. So we're going to look at nursery stock and the pros and cons of the different types of stock. We're going to look at bare rooting, the process of removing soil or potting medium from the roots so we can inspect the roots of a plant before we plant it. We'll look at setting the level. What feature of the tree do you use to determine how deep in the hole to plant it relative to grade? We'll look at the hole itself. What should its dimensions be? Who's going to dig it? And what kind of techniques exist for digging holes and what are their pros and cons? And then we'll look at the planting process itself. First for bare root trees, next for container trees, then for balled and burlap trees, and lastly we'll look at replanting where we're taking an already planted tree and for one reason or another moving it to another site. Let's start with the best time to plant. For most trees, that's the fall, late fall, after the trees go dormant. For deciduous trees again. That is after its leaves fall off, which is November, December, very late October. And we do some planting occasionally even in January because we have such mild winters. Now there are some species that do better with spring planting. Black gum, southern magnolia, river birch, and all of the oaks other than pin oak. But if planting in spring, we're talking about early spring, March, because trees need to have time in the ground after planting to acclimate to their new home before they get hit by the heat of summer. Summer heat will kill new plantings very, very quickly. So fall's a much better time to plant for most species. And conifers, you can plant them in the spring, as long as it's early, and you can plant them in the fall. But most of the examples we're going to be talking about here are going to be deciduous. Here are the three types of nursery stock. Bare root, which are trees that you buy that have nothing on their roots, no soil, no potting medium. Container trees, which are planted in potting medium, which is basically mulch. And then ball and burlap trees, which come in the native soil that they're grown in at the nursery. And there are pros and cons to each of these. For bare roots, it's great from the standpoint of roots. The root mass is intact. You get all of the roots. They're easy to handle because they're light. They don't have any soil on the roots or potting medium. They typically require a smaller hole. There's less transplant shock because they haven't lost a lot of their roots or they haven't had to be bare rooted, which can be somewhat traumatic for the tree. They're clearly the fastest growing because their root mass is intact and we don't mess around with it. And they're typically the lowest cost. On the downside, they're kind of hard to find. There's a narrow selection of species, limited sources to get them from. Their roots are exposed, so you have to be very careful with them. And you need to plant them right away or go through a process called healing in, where you plant them temporarily. We'll show you what we're talking about with that in a moment. For container trees, they are the easiest to find. There's a very wide selection of species, moderate cost. You can find them at all nurseries, the big box stores, and so on. They're usually not too heavy, certainly compared with B&B trees, though they are considerably heavier than bare root. Their root mass is intact. It's all there. And there's less transplant shock than you have with bald and burlap trees, where a lot of their root mass is cut off and left in the ground. The downside of container trees is that they typically have the worst root problems, and we'll explain why shortly. Lastly, we have bald and burlap trees, referred to as B&B trees. And these are typically larger trees. They may be 1 3/4 inches up to 3-inch diameter trees, big trees. And there's typically a very wide selection of species for them, and they're really the only option for big trees. You can't get a big tree in a container, and you can't get a big tree bare root. On the downside, they're very, very heavy, so they're hard to handle. They need a big hole. They've lost most of their root mass. We'll show you how they are harvested. That explains that. And they're typically slow to establish because they have to spend the first couple of years building root mass before they're going to start to increase in girth or height. And because they're larger trees, they're typically the most costly. So we're going to talk a lot about roots. With bare root trees, you can see everything. Their entire root system is exposed because there's no potting material, no soil on them. And you can see the above ground and the below ground surface, whereas you can't with container and B&B trees. You can't see the roots, and you usually can't even see the root collar, which is a critical feature that we'll be talking about quite a bit here, because they're typically buried in either soil or potting medium. And what's not visible when you buy the tree is just as important as what is visible. The roots are exposed through a process called bare rooting, and we'll show you how we do that. Bare rooting is a process that removes the soil or potting medium from the roots and allows us to inspect them to see if they're in good shape, to do any pruning that we need to do if they're not in good shape, and so on. Ideally, we reveal the entire root structure by bare rooting before we plant a tree. But there are some cases where one reason or another comes up where we can't do that. So at a minimum, we try to get the soil or potting medium off the top, say 3 inches of the bottom of the trunk and the start of the root collar and root system. If you're going to have root problems, they're typically right there at the top. The process of bare rooting involves removing the native soil from field-grown trees or the potting medium from container trees. The purpose of bare rooting, there are several. First, you want to reveal the feature of the tree referred to as the root collar, which typically is buried 2 or 3 inches down under either soil for field-grown trees or with potting medium for container trees. Next, you want to inspect the roots for problems that might need correction, some root pruning, for example. Additionally, with your container trees, you want to keep the potting medium out of the hole, so you want to separate it from the roots, put it aside, and then you're going to use it later for mulching, because basically potting medium is mulch. We'll talk more about that later. And lastly, we want to free up the roots from the root ball, from the soil or potting medium that they're in, so that they can be spread out and allowed to grow straight outward naturally. Okay, so your first task in the process of bare rooting is to locate the feature called the root collar. In this photograph, where the blue line is, shows where the trunk ends and the roots begin. And that feature right at that point is called the root collar. And when you're trying to determine how deep you're going to dig your hole, you start by measuring for the top at the root collar and then down to the bottom of the root structure. Although these are kind of flimsy roots, so you'd actually push up on them a little bit from the bottom in order to determine exactly what the bottom height is. So find the root collar before you start to dig the hole. Remove the soil or potting medium, exposing the root collar. Measure the distance from the root collar to the bottom of the root mass. And as I mentioned, push up a little bit on those loose roots to determine the actual bottom, because you don't want to dig your hole too deep. In fact, you want to start with a shallow hole and deepen it as needed. So you might start out digging a hole maybe a foot deep, put the tree in the hole. If you find that's a little bit too shallow, take a little bit more out. It's preferable to go shallow at the start and then dig deeper as you need to than it is to dig the hole too deep and then have to backfill it and try to compact it to create a new bottom. That natural bottom is really what you're shooting for, is what you want at the bottom of the hole, instead of a backfilled bottom or an artificial bottom. In this photo, you can clearly see the root collar, the point where the trunk stops and the roots begin. This is the feature you'll use to determine hole depth. And basically, you want to compensate a little bit for settlement. We typically plant trees an inch or two, maybe even 3 inches high, because we've disturbed all the soil when we've dug the soil out of the hole in order to place the tree in it. And when we put the soil back in and mix it with water, it's typically going to settle an inch or two or so. So we plant it deliberately high. Here is why locating the root collar and using it correctly to place the tree in the hole is critical. In the photo on the left, we have a tree that was planted too low, and on the right, one that was planted too high. Looking at the photo on the right first, the problem is obvious. The root collar is perched about 6 inches above grade, that is, above ground level. In that photo, you can clearly see that just above the root collar, the point where the roots begin, the trunk flares out. It becomes wider just above where the roots start. But in the photo on the left, you can't see the root flare at all, no less the root collar itself. So the tree on the left was planted too deep. The only way you could tell how deep would be to excavate around the trunk to locate the root collar. If these trees were recently planted, they could be replanted correctly. The tree on the left would be dug out of the hole and replanted higher by backfilling the hole and creating a new higher bottom by compacting soil at the bottom of the hole. The tree on the right would need a deeper hole. The exposed roots of the tree on the right are unprotected and subject to damage from lawnmowers, string trimmers, and to damage from insects and larger critters, as well as from heat and cold. The effects of burying the trunk on the tree on the left are just as significant. The bark, which will be continually damp from contact with soil moisture, will rot and deteriorate. Roots will begin to grow from the trunk above the root collar, and gas exchange will be obstructed at the base of the tree. This is why it's really important to know how to locate the root collar and use it to set the level when planting a tree. Okay, so let's say you're doing your own tree. If we're doing the planting, we're going to bare root most of the time. It's relatively rare that we don't bare root a tree. There may be time constraints, there may be one issue or another that would cause us not to, but that's rare. But for your own trees, maybe you don't want to go through all the work. But at least you want to expose the root collar. And here's the problem. With your bald and burlap trees, we're going to show you the process by which these are harvested in a little bit and then surrounded by burlap and a wire cage put around them. And in the process of doing that, it causes loose soil to be forced upward around the base of the tree. So the root collar ends up being buried in a B&B tree. Similarly, in a container tree, as they move it from smaller pots to larger pots, as the tree grows larger, more and more soil is added, and it ends up that the root collar ends up getting buried. So you need to, at a minimum, take off enough soil to be able to see the root collar, and maybe the next inch or two down, because if you're going to have root problems, most likely they're going to be right at the top of the root system where the big roots are. Also, if you're doing a B&B tree, you want to take off the wire cage and burlap. Here are photos of some lazy planters. In the photo on the left, they didn't bother to take anything off the root ball of this B&B tree. On the right, you can see the result of failing to remove the wire cage. It has girdled the roots, cutting circulation from the roots upward into the tree. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the hole. First thing is, as we're doing a planting project for tree stewards, we have to figure out who's going to dig the holes. Are we going to, if it's a small planting and we're just doing, a couple trees or half a dozen trees, we'll probably do the digging ourselves. If we're doing a larger planting, though, we usually will find someone, typically someone who will volunteer digging the holes for us using some kind of a mechanized device, and we'll look at those in a moment. We need to know when they're going to be dug, because having a ground surface with a bunch of holes dug in it, it's a little bit hazardous, so we want to make sure that we do the planting promptly after the holes are dug. We want to know what technique was used to dig them, because that's going to tell us how much shaping or finishing of the hole is needed. If you dig, well, let's look at the options and you'll see what some of the problems are with them. So the most controllable technique for digging a hole is pick and shovel. You can make it exactly what you want it to be with that technique. A lot faster and more efficient is using an auger. The problem with an auger is you have to be really good with the auger to be able to dig a hole that is not completely vertical on the sides. It's usually going to be too deep. The movement of the auger device against the walls of the hole will typically glaze them, which means you've got to break up those walls in order for the roots to be able to penetrate them. So there are downsides to using an auger. Then there's a backhoe. A backhoe will dig a hole for you. Sometimes, though, you can't get the vehicle to where you need it because of access issues, because they're pretty big. And it's not going to give you a perfectly shaped hole unless you have a very experienced, very competent operator. You usually end up with a hole too big and you've got to backfill it. And then there's stump grinder, which is, as you would probably know, is typically used to grind up the stump of a tree that's left in the ground after the tree's been removed. But they're really good for digging holes. Again, you have complete control over the size and shape of the hole and the depth, and it leaves the soil in really marvelous condition for the slurry that you're going to create when you add water around the roots. You don't have to worry about leaving any voids because the soil is almost the consistency of flour. So it's a really good approach. Okay, so pick and shovel, hard work, but the most control over your finished product. Stump grinder, we happen to have one available to us, but if you had to go out and buy one, they're not cheap. There are some places that are kind of tight where you can't get them in. Sometimes when you're working between a sidewalk and street curb, there's not enough room to move it. Augers, you have problems having the hole depth be shallow enough, having problems with slick sides and that sort of thing, so you have to reshape the holes. Backhoe, you've got access issues. You've got to get that big vehicle in. Sometimes you can't do that. And you usually have to do a little work on the hole. But in general, if you've got to have 50 holes dug, I'd rather have any of those devices doing it rather than me with a pick and shovel. Okay, so when it comes to preparing the hole, generally you want your hole to be considerably wider than the root ball, because that allows you to break up a lot of soil and make it easy for the roots of the newly planted tree to be able to penetrate that soil before they hit the edges, which are more compacted soil. So you want it wider. It doesn't have to be particularly deep, and you want to start out with a shallow hole and make it deeper as you need to. If your hole is too deep, you've got to backfill and create an artificial compacted bottom. It's better to have the natural bottom to it. where you can, which really says that the ideal way to do this is to bare root your tree before you dig the hole, because then you can get perfectly accurate measurements. But again, if you're doing 50 trees at one time, you're probably not going to be doing individual hand dug holes. In any case, you'll want the sides to be sloped. You don't want it to be a square, squared off side hole. You want to keep turf out of the hole. Usually you're planting on a lawn or in a meadow in an open space where there's something growing there, and you don't want what's growing there in the hole, because it creates the same problem that putting potting medium into the soil creates. That is, the turf will be breaking down and absorbing oxygen that you want to be being reserved for the roots to take up. So you want to keep the sod out of the hole, sod or turf. You want to break up the soil into small pieces. You don't want to have air pockets or voids in between big chunks of soil, because the roots won't go there. Roots won't go anywhere where there's a vacuum. They want to be growing in between soil particles, because it's in between the soil particles that the water and nutrients are stored. You want to make sure that the sides of the hole are kind of chopped up or scored, so it's easier for the roots to penetrate. You will probably find situations where you'll have one or two roots that are longer than the rest of them, and instead of making the hole bigger, the entire hole bigger just to accommodate a couple long roots, you might want to just dig a small slot into the side of the hole and fit those long roots into it. And if your roots are going to be of one of two types, they're either going to be very loose and flimsy, or they're going to be very stiff. And if they're loose and flimsy, you're probably going to have to build a mound at the bottom of the hole and drape those loose roots over the mound so that they stay supported going outward, as opposed to just being forced downward, straight down, as you backfill the hole. We'll demonstrate this with some photos in a moment. And if you do build a mound at the bottom of the hole, when you start to backfill and create your slurry, don't undermine that mound. Keep it intact so that your roots remain suspended by it. And of course, somebody needs to be checking on the front end to make sure that where you're digging your holes, you're not going to be cutting into some type of utility line or whatever. Let's look at some special steps that are needed when preparing the hole for a tree to be planted on a slope. Tree stewards encounter this situation occasionally when planting on an embankment adjacent to a roadside, or when planting in a hilly area. If the hole is dug normally, roots on the uphill side of the hole will end up buried too deeply, and those on the downhill side will be too shallow or exposed. The solution is to create a small terrace or shelf by removing soil from the uphill side of the hole and filling in on the downhill side with the excavated soil. In the diagram on the right, the original slope of the hillside is modified. Soil made available by cutting into the uphill side of the planting hole is added on the downhill side to extend the terrace or shelf, and a berm or lip is created on the downhill side to trap water which would otherwise run off. In very steep situations, the downhill side of the slope may need to be reinforced, as shown in the photo on the left. All right, so we have three categories of rootstock that we're going to look at: bare root, container, and B&B. Let's look at the bare root trees. Bare root trees are the easiest trees to plant because you don't have to go through the bare rooting process, because they're already bare rooted. That's how they come. In the lower left, you'll see some 4 or 5 foot tall ones, and you can see their root structure is intact. They just don't have anything covering them. They don't have topsoil or planting medium around them. What is typically used for them is pictured in the top photo. That material is called hydrogel, and they cover the roots with those, and it keeps them moist until they reach you. In the lower right, you'll see seedlings. I'm a member of the Arbor Day Foundation, and every year they send you 10 seedlings, and the roots are hydrogeled. And as soon as you get them, you rinse off the hydrogel and either plant them right away, or you have to heel them in. We'll discuss healing in a moment. But it's a pretty efficient way to get your trees because you don't have to bare root them. You can see exactly what you're getting. If there are problems, you could deal with them because they're visible without the effort of removing soil or potting material. This is healing in, where basically you just dig kind of a trench or a small hole, lay it in, cover it with soil, and keep it watered until you're ready to plant it. So, I usually end up, for whatever reason, getting them in the mail like around Tuesday, and maybe I can't get to putting them into the ground until Saturday. I will heal them in for those few days, and sometimes it's a week or two before I can get to it. So you don't want them sitting out with the roots exposed. You need to get them covered. So heal them in. Okay, so I mentioned before that particularly for your smaller trees, a lot of your container trees and most of your small bare root trees, a lot of them will have very flimsy, soft roots. And if you simply hold that over the hole and backfill around it, all of the roots are going to be forced straight down. So in order to avoid that, you need to build a mound at the base of your hole. So here's your hole, slight sloped edges, wider than the root section that you're putting into the ground, and you've built a mound. And here's what it looks like. So you've got your hole, but you build a mound, and then you put your tree in there, and you drape those loose roots over the hole, over the mound, such that when you start to backfill into the hole, these aren't forced straight down. They're kept in the correct position, moving outward laterally instead of going straight down. Now the other situation you'll find is that the roots are pretty stiff like this, and it can just stand on its own right on its roots. You don't need to build a mound in that situation. You'd simply measure from here at the root collar down to the bottom of the lowest one, and you go, okay, well that's 8 inches. I need a hole that's 8 inches. Actually, you could probably get by with a hole that's about 7 inches. Because here in this example, they're actually getting ready to plant this a little low. I would want to have this another inch or so higher than what they're doing. Also, their hole's pretty narrow. You'd probably want that hole to be another at least 6 inches wide all around. And you'd want it not quite as deep as that. Everybody's a critic. On the subject of root problems, here's some examples of what you're looking for when you bare root a tree. One of the main reasons of bare rooting, again, being to identify root problems before you put the tree into the ground. First, to figure out whether it's suitable for planting at all. And then secondly, if it is, what kind of corrections you might have to do from the standpoint of pruning in order to ensure that the tree survives. The photo on the upper right is an example of a tree that I wouldn't try to plant. There are several very large roots, all of which are trained to go in circles, and they will never straighten out. And if you were to try to prune them all the large ones that are circling, you'd be taking off so much root mass that it's doubtful that the tree would survive. So that's one that I wouldn't even try. The other two photos are examples of situations where root pruning would probably be a satisfactory solution. The photo on the left, we're going to show a series of photos of how we corrected that one. The one on the lower right, you actually have the top couple roots just below the root collar are actually fused into the trunk and would have to be taken off with a hammer and chisel. They'd have to be chipped away. But you have to take those off because they're girdling, and they're going to be cutting off circulation from the roots up into the body of the trunk of the tree and upward. So if they don't come off, the tree's not going to succeed. What we're looking for when we bare root a tree and what we're trying to correct for are situations like this. Here we have a circling root, and this is a mature tree. This root should have been taken off at the time that it was planted because it would have been obvious then, just as we saw in those prior photos. But they didn't take them off, and what's going to happen over time is as this root becomes larger in girth and diameter, and the trunk of the tree becomes larger in diameter, they're going to come in contact with each other, and the root is going to start to girdle the trunk. That is, it's going to constrain the growth of the trunk. It's going to press forward into it and constrict the movement of water and nutrients through the vascular system. And will look like this. So this is no longer referred to as a circling root. This is now referred to as a girdling root, or it's girdling the tree. That is, it's growing right into the trunk. And you can see the damage that's being done here. It's losing bark because, as you'll recall from our tree biology classes, the vascular system is just inside the bark, and this is cutting it off. So it's not getting good flow of water, nutrients, and food right here through the phloem and xylem. So that should have been taken off at the point of planting. This series of photos shows how we correct a root problem. We showed this tree actually a couple slides ago. In photo number 1 in the upper left, we're making the initial cut. In the second photo, you can see the cut has been made. In the third photo, we're getting ready to come around to the left side and make the cut where that circling root originated from. And on the fourth photo, you can see it's been removed. So now with that circling root out of the picture, it will never have the opportunity to grow into becoming a girdling root. And it's pretty simple. We just made 2 cuts. There's still plenty of good root structure left for the tree, so it's going to do fine. A couple of comments on this photo. First thing is you can see that to aid them in the process of bare rooting this tree, they used a hose. You can see it's all wetted down. And a hose can be really useful for helping to loosen up and remove either the soil or the potting medium. In this case, it's a container tree, and this is potting medium. Secondly, though, there are 2 root problems shown here. In the arrow that comes from the lower left, it's pointing towards a circling root, which will soon become a girdling root, and that would be cut right at the point where the tip of that arrow is, up against the trunk. And the second root pruning issue here is shown with the arrow that starts in the upper right. And you would make the cut right at the point of that arrow. That's a root which is making a right-hand turn, and it's never going to straighten out. So you would just make the cut right there at the tip of the arrow, and it would actually bud out from that and start to grow a new root from it, which most likely would not be making that right-hand turn. It's making the right-hand turn because it was stuck in a pot and didn't have anywhere else to go. Once it's in the ground, it'll be able to move out freely. So these are typical of simple root pruning examples that would be very helpful to this tree before you put it in the ground, and you wouldn't have seen those if you didn't bare root it. Okay, so we talked a little about planting we talked a little bit about bare root trees. Now we'll look at container trees, then we'll look at B&B trees. So container trees are not planted in soil. They're planted in a material called potting medium, which is basically mulch. It's ground up bark, typically pine bark, sometimes a little sand and a little fertilizer in it. And you can see here the little blue line that goes into each of the containers. That's water. Every day they put water through it. And if soil was in there instead of potting medium, it would hold that water and the roots would rot. That's why they use mulch. They can water it daily. The water drains through and doesn't cause the roots to rot. So that's why you have mulch in pots instead of soil. Our task when bare rooting a container tree is to convert what you see in the photo on the left, which is what a tree looks like when you take it out of its container, to what you see on the right, which is a tree that's been bare rooted and is ready to be planted. And in your bare rooting process, as we've discussed before, you want to remove that potting medium. You don't want that in the hole for reasons we've discussed before. Secondly, you want to expose the root collar, which in the photo on the left, you can't even see it. It's probably 2 inches below the top level of the potting medium. And thirdly, you want to free up the roots so that they're no longer circling. They're going out straight from their point of emanation on the trunk. So that's the goal with bare rooting a container tree. Here are a couple of other examples of what your root ball is going to look like for a container tree once you get it out of the pot. This is very typical. This is pretty much what they all look like. So you take it out of the container, you expose the root collar first, you loosen the roots and spread them out. You get off as much of the potting medium as you can. We typically do this on a tarp so we can save it. You want to keep the potting medium, since it is mulch, and use it for mulching purposes when the tree is done being planted. And then of course you do any pruning that's necessary, and then you're ready to plant. And you can take the measurements that you need to. Now we'll take a look at a short video on root preparation for a container tree. So go to the next slide, hover your cursor at the bottom left of the screen, and press the button to activate the video. What we're going to do here is demonstrate how to prepare a container tree, or a tree in a pot, for planting. Unfortunately, the fact that they're grown in a pot creates two problems, big problems for their root systems. The first problem is, as we'll see when we take it out of the pot and take a look at it, the roots grow out 360 degrees from the trunk, but they soon hit the inside of the container, and they can no longer move out directly as they would in nature, as all of these trees have grown. And they have to go up or down or around, and typically what they do is they circle. So when we get this out of the pot, we're going to see that it's going to be a tangled mass of roots with lots of them circling round and around. The second problem is, quite often this portion of the tree, the lower portion of the tree, becomes buried in this material, this potting medium, because every time they're moved from a smaller to a larger container as they grow, more and more material is thrown in on top, and it tends to get buried here. And you don't want that section buried when you plant it. And there's a particular feature there called the root collar, which is the point where the trunk ends and the roots begin, that we have to be able to see, because that's the indicator, the feature that tells us how to plant the tree vertically in the hole compared to grade. So those are the two problems, circling roots and a buried root collar. So with that said, first thing to do is to take it out of the pot. And one thing I'll mention is, you might think, well, we'll just grab it and lift it out. First and foremost, you never want to try to lift it or move it by the trunk, because that can break your roots. You always want to be lifting it by the edges or by the bottom. So the first thing we usually do is just press on it a little bit, roll it a little. While we're pressing on it, maybe tap on it a bit. And I'm looking at the root system while I'm doing this, or rather the branches, to make sure I'm not damaging them. And let me see if we'll get it out. If not, we'll go to the next step. Not quite ready to come yet. Alrighty. There we go. All right. So here you can see that the roots have grown out to the edge, hit the edge, and started to circle. Before we get started on freeing up these roots, let me show you some of the tools that you'll probably find to be convenient for this purpose. A screwdriver or something else like that is always good for trying to loosen some of these up. You may have to prune some roots, so it's good to have a pruning shears. You can use a tool like this to try and loosen up some of the potting medium to remove it. We want to get as much of this potting medium off as we can, because we don't want it in the hole. What potting medium is it's not soil, it's mulch. And it's little bits of ground up bark. And if that goes into the hole, it's going to decay, and as it decays, it absorbs oxygen.
which means it's competing with the roots that want the same oxygen that's in the hole. So we don't want to have this stuff in the hole. We're simply going to collect it here, and we'll put it on top of the hole once we have it planted. Let's see, and then we have a hammer and chisel, which on rare occasions we'll need if we find that there is a root which has grown around actually the base of the trunk and grown into it, in which case we'll have to chip it off. Hopefully we won't have to do that. This is a typical situation you'll find on the bottom, and this is going to go nowhere. A lot of times what people will do is they'll take a saw and they'll just cut the whole bottom inch off. All of this will go. We've revealed a couple of roots here which have some deformities. You'll see this one comes up and just takes a right angle. It's never going to straighten out. Also, it's broken here, and it wasn't anything I did. It's an old break. So we're just going to prune that off right at just above where that angle is. And if we found other roots like that with a right angle, we'd cut them off because they'll never straighten out. So we could go with this right now and plant it. The only glitch is right here. We may have some root problems here, and I can't tell because the soil is frozen. So we're going to stop for a moment. We're going to put a little water on it and see if we can defrost these and get a look at what's under here. You can see that we found we had to use some a hose because the top part of the root ball was frozen, and there wasn't any way we were manually going to be able to deal with it. The water temperature of the water in the hose is warmer than the ice, so we were able to use it to help us to see what's going on here. Now it is okay to pick it up by the trunk because there's no weight on the root ball anymore. This whole tree now weighs about 10 pounds, whereas before it weighed about 50 or 60. You can see kind of the finished product here. It ended up that we had to use a hose to water down the root ball because the top portion of the root ball had frozen. That potting medium in there was frozen. We couldn't get it out manually without putting some water on it, the water temperature being warmer than the frozen material. And it cleaned up very well, and you can see it has a very beautiful, dense, full root system. When it comes time to plant, our job as we're backfilling will be to hold these outward so that they're growing out and not all down. Gravity is now pulling them all downward. We'll be holding them up and putting soil underneath them and on top of them to hold them in place. And you'll see that when we do the planting video. But let me mention another important issue here, and that is the root structure is one of the problems with container trees. The second problem we mentioned was burying this section called the root collar. Here's your root collar right here, right in this area here. You can see the trunk is stopping. You see the color changes actually from this deeper green, I hope it is, to this lighter color. That's the root collar right there. Trunk stops, roots start. That's the feature you're going to use as a basis for your measurements for how deep your hole should be. And why that's important is that that's where we're going to take our measurement to decide how deep our hole is going to be. So the top part of our measurement would be right here at the root collar, and then we would come down to the bottom of the roots, but it'll be the bottom of the roots with them flared out, as they will be when we plant. And in this case it's, what do you say, 15 inches. So we would not want to dig our hole deeper than 15 inches deep. So that's another kind of lesson, is it's ideal to bare root your tree, to go through the process we've just gone through before you dig your hole. Now that's not always possible, but certainly if you're digging your holes first, a good idea is to not dig them much deeper than about 12 to 14 inches, because it's easier to take those last couple inches out than it is to have to backfill the hole and compact the soil to create a new higher bottom. And in the end, you're actually going to end up planting it a little bit higher than 15 inches because all the soil you've taken out of the hole is loose, and over time, in the couple of months after you plant it, it's going to settle and the tree is going to drop. So we deliberately plant the tree 2, sometimes maybe even 3 inches higher than grade level. We perch it up here a little bit because it's going to sink. Anyhow, this was all about how we prepare a container tree's roots for planting.
Now let's take a look at root preparation and planting for a balled and burlap tree, a B&B tree. In the upper right, you'll see some 250 to 300 pound root ball trees for planting that we helped the students at Albemarle High School plant on their campus. And the lower left photo shows what it takes to get one of these things from point A to point B. It took 3 of us to get this off the truck. So they're pretty heavy. Quite often what we'll do is we'll bare root them at the nursery. So we leave all that soil in the ground. And we'll show you how we do that later on. Here's a quick summary of bare rooting a B&B tree. In the photo in the upper left, we're cutting off the wire cage. Following that, we'll cut the twine and remove the burlap. And you'll see in the upper right what it looks like once you've got the root ball exposed. In the lower left, we're starting to go through the bare rooting process of getting the soil off the roots. And in the lower right, you see pretty much the finished product. You'll note that we haven't taken off every bit of the soil, but this is native soil from the nursery. We don't have to take it all off if we've gotten to the point where we've cleared and been able to identify the root collar and gotten off most of the soil so that we can see the root structure and do any root pruning that we would have to do. But we don't need all the soil off because this is, again, native soil. It's not potting medium. So we can put this into the hole and there's no problem of oxygen depletion, which is a problem you do have with potting medium. Now we could have used a hose and taken off even more of the soil, but it was really unnecessary because we could see everything we needed to at this stage. In the next slide, we'll show you a short video of what the process looks like when a tree spade removes a tree from the ground at a nursery, which is the first phase of preparing a balled and burlap tree. Once the tree spade has the tree out of the ground and suspended, it lowers it into what you see on the left, which is a piece of burlap which is suspended over a wire cage. So it places the root ball into the wire cage. Then the burlap and wire cage are secured around the base of the tree, such that you have a product that looks like the photo on the right, and it's ready for shipment. As an option to moving around these really heavy and ungainly B&B trees, when tree stewards are doing large plantings, 20, 30, 50 trees at a time or more, we will actually go to the nursery, and as the tree spade takes the trees out of the ground, we bare root them on site. On the left-hand side of this photo, you can see a tree that's just been taken out of the ground by the spade. And as you move to the right across the background of the photo, you can see that we're in the process of bare rooting several additional trees, ending up with the tree in the foreground on the left, where it's completely bare rooted, and we're taking a look at whether we need to do any root pruning. Now the issue here, of course, is you've got to keep these roots moist since they don't have the soil to protect them anymore between the time that they're bare rooted and the time that we put them into the ground at planting. So often we'll bare root at the nursery in the morning and plant in the afternoon, or sometimes we'll do the bare rooting on one day and plant the next day. Whatever the duration is between the time we take them out of the ground and plant them, we keep the roots moist. We water them down with a hose and then wrap them in burlap and keep the burlap wet between that period of time between bare rooting and putting them in the ground, because we don't want them to dry out. The problem we mentioned before with B&B trees, in addition to the difficulty in dealing with them because they're so heavy, is that when the tree spade makes the cut to take it out of the ground, it leaves 80 to 90% of the root structure in the ground and only takes about 10% of it with it. So in the upper photo, you can see the circle is drawn there. Everything outside that circle is left in the ground. In the photo at the lower right, you can see that's all that you get. So all the rest of that root structure has to be replaced by the tree. And this is why B&B trees tend to be slow to grow for the first couple of years after you plant them, because most of their growth effort is going into replacing their root structure. Now we're going to look at the tree planting process. It starts out with bare rooting a B&B tree, but then goes on to get into the generic planting process, which is the same regardless of what form the tree comes to you in, whether it's already bare rooted, whether it's a container tree which you've bare rooted or at least taken off the top few inches of the potting material so that you can get a look at where the root collar is and whether there are any root problems at the top, or whether it's a B&B tree. So just click on the arrow below to start the video.
This video shows how to bare root and plant a balled and burlap tree. The planting was done in McIntyre Park in Charlottesville, Virginia by the Charlottesville Area Tree Stirrers, an all-volunteer organization dedicated to maintaining the existing tree canopy and expanding it. As we proceed, we will list the kinds of tools and materials needed at each stage in the planting process. At the start of the planting process, you will need the following tools and materials: a tarp to collect soil taken off the roots of the tree, bolt cutters to cut the heavy gauge wire of the cage securing the burlap to the root ball, a box cutter or knife to cut off the burlap, pruning tools in case any pruning is needed, and a hose or bucket of water to assist with bare rooting and to keep the roots moist once the soil has been removed.
Okay, so this tree is in the form they call balled and burlapped. As you can see, the root ball, the soil around the roots has been wrapped in burlap, and then a wire cage is placed around it in order to keep it secure. So the first thing we need to do is to take the wrappings off, starting with cutting off the wire cage. Somebody want to cut the other side?
Want you guys to help?
Yeah. The reason we're doing this is to be able to get access to the root ball so that we can then see what the roots look like. Coming in. So we're going to start this process of bare rooting the tree, removing the soil from around the roots so that we can inspect the roots and decide whether it's going to be suitable for planting or whether we need to do some pruning on the roots, or sometimes the roots are so poorly formed that we can't even plant the tree. So that's what we're going to start now. So we're just teasing the soil away from the roots. The soil is pretty loose, so it's coming off fairly easily. Sometimes you have to use a tool to get the soil off. And we're saving the soil because we'll use it in the planting process later.
This is actually pretty much soil. Yeah, this is good. It's better than I thought it was going to be.
When you go to buy a tree at a nursery or at a big box store, you can see the trunk and you can see the branches, but you can't see the roots. So to make sure you're not trying to put a tree into the ground that has a root structure that's seriously deformed, you have to get the soil off and take a look. So the roots are all
Turn it over now.
coming out laterally, which is the way you want them to be coming out. Yeah, let's turn.
Bare rooting the tree in this video revealed no significant root problems, so no root pruning was needed. This is not always the case. Often you will find dead, damaged, circling, or girdling roots that need to be removed. Sometimes root problems are so severe that the tree will not be able to succeed and should not be planted. At the planting phase, you will need the following tools and materials: a tarp, a shovel, a mattock, and a tamping bar in case you run into rocks, something to measure with to get the correct dimensions for the hole, some kind of water source, such as a hose or buckets of water. The tree will need up to 15 gallons of water at planting, organic mulch of some kind, such as shredded bark or wood chips, and compost, which is natural fertilizer to provide nutrients for the newly planted tree. No other fertilizer is needed. For the period of time between bare rooting the tree and planting it, keep the root ball moist and covered to protect it from heat, wind, and sun. The exposed roots can quickly dry out. We usually pour some water on the roots and cover the root ball with a tarp until the tree goes into the ground. Before we plant it, that is while the tree is still lying on the ground, we need to check the branches to see if any pruning is needed. Very little pruning should be done at the planting stage, since the tree will need all its branches to survive. But sometimes branches are damaged while being transported, and they should be pruned, along with any dead branches, at this point.
Yeah, the first thing is we want to clean up the tree, take everything off of it that's on it. It's a pretty tall tree. It's harder to do this once the tree is up, so we do this while it's still on the ground. But we already dug the hole, and we're not sure it's quite right, so we're going to lift the tree and
and place it into the hole just to get a sense of whether the hole is deep enough and wide enough for the planting.
Deciding how deep and wide the hole should be is mainly based on the size of the root ball. Measure its width and depth. The farthest the roots extend downward from the trunk determines how deep the hole should be. Even for this large tree, the root ball is only 14 inches deep, so you don't have to dig a deep hole. But the tree will do better if the hole is much wider than the root ball, ideally 3 times as wide at the top and gradually sloping to a narrower bottom.
Talk about this.
Yes, so when you just try to decide whether the tree is properly placed vertically relative to ground level, grade, we place a stake across the top of the hole, and then we want to make sure that this feature right here, which is the point where you can see the trunk comes down and starts to flare out here, and this point in the flare right here is where the roots start. That's the level that we use to determine how deep we want to plant it. And since we've disturbed all this soil and we're going to be putting in loose soil around it, it's going to settle a little bit. So we deliberately are going to plant the tree a little bit high because eventually it'll settle. And right now it's just about where we want it, but it doesn't take into consideration settlement. So we're probably going to put a little bit of soil underneath to lift it a little, maybe about an inch. Hang on a second.
He's compressing it so it's a little bit more solid.
Okay. So we built a little bit of a mound of soil at the bottom of the hole.
You can hold it up
just to give it a
Oh.
kind of a little pedestal to rest on. And we're going to pull
good.
all these roots outward, because the ideal position for the roots would be coming out this way, a little bit downward and outward. If we didn't pull them out like this and we start to put in soil, they'd all be pushed downwards, straight down, and we don't want that to happen. We want them to be going outward like this. So we're starting the process that they call backfilling. So we're taking the soil, putting it back into the hole, and my job is to work the soil in around the roots so that there aren't any air holes. And in a moment we're going to add some water and make kind of a big mud pie, what we call a slurry. The purpose of that is to make sure there aren't any air holes. Because where there are air holes, it doesn't do the roots any good, because
Water now?
yeah, because there's nothing in that hole for the tree to use. It wants water and nutrients, and the water and nutrients are in the little spaces in between the particles of soil. So now we're going to create a slurry, which just means we're going to throw some water in there.
Enough?
Yep. And we're going to work that muddy mess in between the roots.
You can see how much it's settling.
Yep, and it settles a
Some
little
water.
bit right away. So vinyl gloves are a good thing to use for this. It's pretty warm today, but on a cold day this is no fun if you have wet gloves. So all the while that we're backfilling the hole with the soil, we have to make sure that the tree stands up straight. So one person has the job through the whole process of holding the tree up until the tree can stand on its own by our having filled in enough of the soil to hold it in place. So we'll just continue to backfill like this. We'll get it maybe another third full, and then we'll add some more water and create a new slurry. I'm just working the soil in between the roots and trying to keep them moving outward.
This is also a very useful way to do it, is to put the dirt on a tarp, because it makes it so much easier to backfill the hole.
Very true.
If the soil was out here sitting on the meadow grass, it'd be hard to
get back in. And
Good job. Tap my heat a little bit more. more soil here, doesn't it? Looks like we're a little bit below grade.
We've got
We got compost
Plenty.
in too.
well, plus we have those buckets full.
We
Oh,
have
right,
buckets of
right.
soil. Yeah.
Right. I'll go get some.
Yeah, just get one. I think all of them are going to need you.
We're now going to do what's called top dressing. We're adding a 1-inch layer of compost on top of the soil to provide natural fertilizer for the tree. Combined with the wood chips that we will use for mulch, this is all the additional nutrients the tree will need to augment the nutrients in the soil. Sometimes compost is mixed into the soil in the hole as a process called amending the soil. We prefer top dressing to amending because as the compost decays, it uses oxygen. If the compost is mixed in with the soil, it is competing with the roots for oxygen. Applied on the surface, compost gets its oxygen from the air.
So the last phase of the planting process is to protect the tree by applying mulch. Mulch serves a number of different purposes. It will gradually over time decay just like the compost and release its nutrients into the soil, and the roots will pick them up, use it to grow the tree.
I guess we got one more.
They act as insulation in the cold weather and insulation in the hot weather. They keep the tree a little cooler in the summer and a little warmer, the roots anyhow, in the winter.
Proper mulching uses the 3-3-3 rule. That means leave a space of 3 inches between the trunk and where the mulch starts. The mulch should be no more than 3 inches deep at any point, and it should extend at least 3 feet out in every direction from the trunk of the tree. Now for the post-planting phase, when you may determine that it is necessary to provide protection for the tree against deer, you may need to stake it for support, and you may choose to use a water bag for watering. If you do, the tools and materials that you will need would include a heavy hammer or a stake driver for your stakes, a wire cutter for the wire fencing used in tree cages, cable ties to secure the wire fencing to the stakes used to hold the cage in place, 4-foot high, 2-inch by 2-inch wire mesh fencing, and pressure treated 1 by 1 inch stakes in either 3 or 4 foot length.
Yeah, okay, so the final stage in areas where you have an issue of a lot of deer around is to provide some protection against the deer who have a habit of wanting to do a couple of things. First, they want to browse, they want to chew these nice green tips. And secondly, the male deer, every year they grow a new rack of antlers, and they have kind of a fine velvety cover on them, which ends up being itchy to the deer, and they want to scrape it off. And the perfect thing they think for doing that is the trunk of a thin tree like this.
Sure.
So
Hang on. Good. Good.
all right, then we're going to secure the stake to the cage using cable ties.
The next question is whether your tree needs to be staked. Most trees don't need staking, but bare-rooted trees may because we've taken the heavy soil off the roots. And sometimes trees planted in windy or wet areas need staking. So how do you decide? What you want to do is hold the trunk at about midway to the top of the tree, about halfway up. Gently pull on the trunk side to side. In the meantime, be watching the root ball. If the root ball moves while you're pulling on the trunk, you will need to stake the tree. Staking is temporary, so you're going to want to retest it again at about 3 months after planting. Same procedure. Grab a hold of the trunk at about midway up it and gently pull side to side while looking at the root ball. If it doesn't move, you can take off the stakes and the webbing. If it does move, you'll want to retest it again after about 2 months. The last issue in the post-planting phase is whether you want to use water bags for watering the tree. They're a good idea for many situations. When you use them, you save water. There is no runoff or evaporation, and they are inexpensive and reusable. Keep in mind that around here in the Virginia Piedmont, they are not needed over winter since water demand will have gone down, and they provide a shelter for rodents that can damage the tree. Use them for the first year of planting and until the drip line of the growing tree extends past the area covered by the water bag. Keep watering the tree well for at least the first 3 years. Here's what we did in this video. We bare-rooted the tree and kept the exposed roots moist and covered until planted. We dug the hole as deep as the root ball, but about 3 times as wide. We use the root collar, the point where the trunk stops and the roots start, to set the level of the tree relative to ground level, and plant it a couple inches high to accommodate settling of the soil. We backfilled the hole 1/3 at a time, mixing the soil with water and working it between the roots to avoid air pockets. One of us held the trunk erect until it could stand by itself. We top dressed the soil with compost. We placed organic mulch over the compost using the 3-3-3 rule. And lastly, we provided a tree cage. At this site, deer is a problem, but cages also discourage vandalism in urban areas. This tree didn't need to be staked, but we described how to do it, and we also showed how a water bag can help you meet the water demand of a newly planted tree. Good luck with your tree plantings. For further information, email us at education3@sevilletreestewards.org.
Now we're going to take a look at the process of transplanting a tree. There are occasions when you're going to want to move a tree from its current site to another, and you can do this for small trees, young trees. So you may have a forest tree that you want to move into a landscape. You may have a tree in your yard, or we may have one that's in a public space and we've been asked to move it because something's going to take place in that space, construction or whatever, and they want to save the tree. Occasionally we planted trees for property owners and they've asked us to move it because they're going to build an addition to their house or something. And we want to save trees, so we need to know how to do transplants. Procedurally, what you're going to do is make a cut straight down in order to sever the roots all the way around the tree that you're going to transplant. So if it's like a 1 or 2 inch caliper tree, you're going to want to come out about 16 to 18 inches from the trunk and cut straight down all around. And ideally, you're going to want to be using a tool like what's called a drain spade that has a long blade, 14 to 16 inch blade, so that you sever all the roots. And we like to do this. We're going to try to transplant the tree in the fall, which is the best time to be planting a tree. So in the spring, a few months before, we would make this cut all the way around the base of the tree. We'll illustrate it for you in a moment here. And that gives you the entire growing season for the tree to grow new replacement roots. So it has a very dense root structure near the center of the root ball, such that when you take it out of the ground and transplant it in the fall, it's got a really good head start on developing a good root system. So when it comes to the day you're going to transplant it, you're going to make that cut all over again. You're going to go out to where the original cut was, 16 to 18 inches from the trunk. You're going to cut straight down with a long bladed spade all the way around the base of the tree. Then you want to put a couple of shovels into the ground right next to each other into that cut and gently pry upward. And then move the shovels a few inches away from that point and again gently pry upward, and do that all around the tree until the root ball comes loose. Then you want to have a tarp laid out, and you'll lift the tree out onto the tarp, and then you can move it to wherever it is you need to move it to. And the tarp will catch any soil that might fall off because you want to keep that soil. So your new hole that you're going to put it in can have essentially very close to the same dimensions to what you've just taken out of the ground. You don't have to dig a bigger hole. You can score the sides of it, but you don't have to dig, a 4-foot hole or so. It can be just a little bit larger in width than what you're taking out of the ground, and it can be basically the same depth, maybe even an inch shallower because there may be a little bit of settlement. So you get the tree to your new location, you've dug a hole, it's kind of a mirror image of the hole you just took it out of. You place the tree in it to see how it fits. You'll have a little bit of a margin around the edges. You're going to fill that with any loose soil that you had from taking it out of the ground. You'll backfill the same way you would with a regular planting. That is, you'll put some soil in, you'll mix some water in it to create a slurry, and you'll put some more soil in, some more water, and some more soil and some more water until you're up to grade. And then you'd be following the same rules that you would normally follow depending on location. Does it need deer protection? Does it need, it's not going to need staking because you've got the whole root ball intact. It's not going to fall over. So let me illustrate some of this. So here's either the cut on the day that you're going to move it or the cut that you make in the spring prior to the removal. You're going to cut straight down using a long bladed spade like this. This is called a drain spade, and they come in either 14 or 16-inch blades. Cut straight down all the way around, and you've severed all the roots. So then, ideally 6 months later in the fall, you make that same cut again. Then you want to get a couple shovels into the ground and gently pry upward and just move around it, gently prying upward all the way around until it comes loose. Lift it out onto a tarp, and then you can move it using the tarp. And once you get it to its new location, you know what its exact dimensions are. You can dig your new hole to be just slightly wider. It can be about the same depth, or as I mentioned before, maybe an inch shallower. Certainly don't make it any deeper because you don't want your root collar to be too deep. Put it back in the hole and backfill using the slurry, and you're all set. Then go mulch it, and you're ready to go. All right, so you're going to get to learn by doing. We're going to have our field activity on planting coming up shortly. We'll start out with a demonstration of two different trees, a container tree and a B&B tree. So you can see us bare root each of them, and then you'll see us plant each of them. Then we'll break the group up into teams of 3 class members, each with an experienced tree steward, and you will plant probably 2 trees each, maybe more, we'll see. Okay, so feel free to review any parts of this that you need to review at any time that you like, and good luck. I'll see you at our planting activity. Thank you.